Right, so welcome everyone to the Voice Study Centre for this 2-hour course with Brian Manternach. Brian is Associate Professor in the University of Utah Department of Theatre, a Research Associate for the Utah Center of Ecology, and also a private voice teacher in Salt Lake City, where he's coming from today. Additionally, he's an Associate Editor of the Journal of Singing and a regular contributor to Classical Singer magazine. Today, he's going to explore how we might be able to offer new perspectives on some traditional techniques. So I'll pass over to you, Brian. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jody. I appreciate the invitation to be here today, and I'm looking forward to talking about all these really, what I find to be quite fascinating topics. So, the four areas, they're right there on the screen, the four areas that we're going to discuss. And I've left a little bit, I have about 108 slides. And I'm always guilty of having too many words on each slide. So don't feel obligated to read everything. I keep them up there as reminders, and I've tried to highlight the most pertinent information. But at the end of each of the four sections, I've left a bit of time for questions. So feel free at that time to unmute yourselves and ask the questions, or raise your hand virtually, or even I can see a lot of you. You could put something in the chat at any time, just as a reminder that we can circle back and get to those questions. And then, of course, there'll be time at the end also that we can address anything that hadn't come up yet in any of the previous courses or conversations. So, to hide my, there we go. So Jody said a lot of this stuff already, but here's some of my affiliations. So I've been at the Department of Theater at the University of Utah for about 12 years, 12 or 13 years, where I am an associate professor, a career line professor. It's a non-tenure track position. But I primarily teach voice to students who are musical theater majors. I also teach a voice pedagogy course for the music theater majors and a singing class for acting majors. In addition, then I'm a 1/4 time and 3/4 in theater. I'm a 1/4 time research associate for the Utah Center for Vocology. That's where I work with Dr. Ingo Tietze, Dr. Lynn Maxfield, Dr. Amanda Stark. We have connections with health sciences, communication sciences, disorders, but we're housed here in the College of Fine Arts. So we're kind of a unique animal being situated where we are. And then a couple of my steady writing gigs are for the Journal of Singing as well as Classical Singer magazine. The Summer Vocology Institute is a collaboration of the Utah Center for Vocology and the National Center for Voice and Speech. So we run those summer courses in vocology and offer a certificate of completion at the end of that. And then also a few years ago I did a TEDx talk that you can find on YouTube if you're interested. It's about singing, go figure. So again, I'm Brian Manternach. You're welcome to call me Brian. I use he, him pronouns. My doctorate is from Indiana University, Jacobs School of Music in voice performance. And if you want to know more about me, my website is brianmanternach.com. So the first section that we're going to talk about here, I'm calling Respiration Revisited. Are our current breathing techniques inspired or have they expired? So for voice pedagogues, we're used to seeing images like this in worksheets, handouts, in textbooks. Some of these images seem to be a little more anatomically correct. Some of them seem to be more cartoonish. I always find it interesting to notice whether the figure is facing the left or facing the right. There are always arrows involved. And so it's very much intended to describe the mechanics of breathing. But then there's another element of breath that Thich Nhat Hanh refers to here about a connector in life, life to consciousness, uniting body and thoughts. Breath is often used in spiritual practices. So breath is more than just mechanical. And even when we're talking about breathing for singing, I think we do well to recognize the greater implications of how we use our breath and how that helps us relate to ourselves, our bodies. And that's probably why, if you go to Etsy or any other type of store, you can find a lot of products reminding us to do something that we're doing constantly, all the time, every day, whether we're awake or asleep. So you can wear things on your body while you're casually tossing your hair, reminding you to breathe. You can put a sign on your wall while you're sitting on a bench facing the way opposite of the sign, reminding you to breathe, which I think gets more to the higher consciousness connection rather than the mechanical. So one of our great historical pedagogues, Lamperti, said that the foundation of all vocal study lies in the control of the breath. And I find that to be a loaded statement. First of all, the foundation of all vocal study. But also the word control. Maybe some of that is lost in translation, but control is a word that we'll talk about a bit later on. But this is a very grand statement, and as one of the, I think, fathers of vocal pedagogy, I think this helps us contextualize some of the traditional approaches that we have used for breath. My own teacher at Indiana, Dr. Robert Harrison, used to colloquially say, "No air, no sound. If you're not breathing well, you're not going to sing well." And then he got even more clever and he said, "Well, no air, no sound, no dollars," or pounds or euros, depending on where you're from. So if you're not breathing well, you're not singing well. If you're not singing well, no one is going to pay you to sing, which is the goal for many of the people that we train. George Ganidze is an operatic baritone who sings all over the world. He sings at the Metropolitan Opera as well as many of the major opera houses. I was able to interview him a couple of years ago for Classical Singer, and I asked him specifically about some of the teachers and mentors that he had that had significant influence on his career or his singing. And he specifically made mention of the teacher that he had, his first real voice teacher, when he was only 18. And he still points to the most important lessons he got from that teacher were related to breathing. And as he said, he taught me how to breathe correctly. And he taught him exercises that he is still using today, which he is passing on to his own students. Ganidze is passing on to his own students. So again, getting to this traditional nature of thoughts about breath, exercises related to breath for singing that have been passed down for generations, a very much traditional approach. And there's nothing wrong with that, certainly, but sometimes when we default to tradition, I find that it might get in the way of innovation because we don't question what we have been taught because it has been so prevalent for so long. He went on to say that the most important thing for a singer, so not just for him, but for any singer, is to know how to breathe correctly. There's that loaded word, correctly. It's the basis for everything. He says that if a singer doesn't know how to breathe, they can't sing in a correct and healthy way. And in his opinion, breathing is 70 to 80% of everything for singing. So again, some very weighted statements right there. Breathing 70 to 80%, correct, healthy. If you're not breathing in the correct way, then you're not only going to be unhealthy, but you're probably not going to be, it's going to impact so many other aspects of your singing. So things that I have heard in my own singing training from choir directors, from voice teachers, from music directors, you should not lift your shoulders when you breathe, but you should also not droop your shoulders when you breathe. You should not puff up your chest, but you should not slouch your chest. You should not be holding back your breath, but you should also not be pushing your air out. Make sure that you are not overinflating when you breathe in, but you don't want to underinflate either. You shouldn't hold your stomach tight when you are breathing, but you also shouldn't be too loose or relaxed or unengaged from those muscles. And there are some people who say you should never do isolated breathing exercises, meaning breathing exercises that are not connected into some form of vocalization, while others say you should definitely do isolated breathing exercises to train the system. So often we find with in many aspects of singing training, but certainly in breathing, conflicting statements. One teacher says one thing and another teacher says potentially the complete opposite. And then we can get into the language of when we start getting into breathing technique. There are many styles, many colloquialisms, many terms that people tend to use. So the first is this idea of appoggio, right? That comes from the bel canto technique, coming from the word for to lean. Essentially, the way I most often hear it described is singing on the gesture of inhalation. People talk often about breath support. That's a very loaded word, I find, because it can be translated so many different ways. And I think you could walk into a room of singers and say, I heard you all singing and I think you need better breath support. Most of those singers would say, oh, you're right, I know I do. My teacher's always telling me that. But if you ask them, what does that mean? When you hear you need better breath support, what does that mean to you? I think we get a variety of answers. And I think the primary question that I like to get at when a student tells me, I feel like I need better support, I'll say, well, does that mean, do you feel like you need to do more of something or to do less of something? If you are supporting well for your singing, is it because you are no longer overworking or you are no longer underworking? What's the balance we're looking for? This idea of breath control, that's been mentioned already a couple of times. Lamperti and Gagnezza both mentioned control. I don't love the word control. Other people don't love the word control because it might seem to imply a rigidity or an increase in work or tension. Many people prefer the idea of breath management. So we're not controlling our breath, we're not supporting our singing, we're just managing the air that we take in and out of our bodies in a way that supports the sounds we're intending to make. I think of flow phonation as being most readily associated with Johann Sundberg, the voice scientist Johann Sundberg. This idea that the airflow from the lungs should meet the adduction of the vocal folds at the exact perfect moment to create this nice balance of flow and vocal fold engagement. And so if airflow precedes adduction, then we'll probably have a breathy tone. If adduction precedes airflow, then we'll probably have a glottal or a tight or pressed phonation. Many people advocate a down and out sensation when you're breathing or when you're singing. Others advocate an up and in sensation. Some believe that you should feel down and out when you are inhaling, and then the minute you start to sing, you should start to feel an up and in sensation. People talk about breathing into the belly. And some people point to the belly and say you should expand and breathe from the diaphragm while pointing to their belly, though the diaphragm does not descend into the area of the belly. Maybe that matters, maybe it doesn't, if it's just an image, but it's not necessarily as anatomically correct. Plus, air is not going into the stomach if we're going to talk about breathing into the belly. Some people say breathe from the diaphragm. Other people say sing from the diaphragm, which creates some confusion, especially if you feel like the diaphragm is located somewhere around your belly. The diaphragm, of course, is a muscle of inhalation, so when we are singing, the diaphragm is probably relaxing rather than contracting, so it creates some confusion there. The isolated breathing exercise that lots of people use, I have used with my students, especially as I was a beginning teacher, is to breathe in and then hiss for as long as you can. The other exercise that I find very common is to lie on the floor and set a book on your stomach and see if you can elevate that book as you are breathing. Some people seem to do that by relaxing their abdominal muscles so that they have natural expansion there. Some people just push out their stomach muscles so that they can lift the book. Those are very different results from that exercise, depending on what, and I wonder how useful it is, because people could do either. And then some people also say that as you're lying on the floor, feel as though your lower back area is expanding into the floor. So finding more of a back-centered expansion during breath for singing. This is a very common exercise, that lying on the floor. And then we can get into the more scientific principles of Boyle's Law and Bernoulli and how they may contribute. Many folks understand those, many folks don't. Many folks understand them and never reference them in the studio, and that's perfectly fine. But they're certainly principles that are at play whether we're conscious of them or not. So we can see this sort of can of worms that breath opens up, and even when we're talking about traditional technique or something as ubiquitous as support, we're going to get lots of different definitions of what that could mean. The result of which I think Barbara Draina points out very astutely is she says that when students are unclear what we mean in our directions related to breathing for singing, if they are not clear about that, or if they have some disconnect in what we are saying and how things feel in their own bodies, their response tends to be overworking. It's usually not finding greater balance necessarily. It usually is overworking in a way that doesn't necessarily lead to perfect balance. So we have to be mindful and that could result in overwork in lots of different areas. But that overwork could tend to result in negatively affecting their sound. So of course there are many elements of singing. We think of the big three as breath, phonation, and resonance. Those are the ones that we most readily identify. But of course registration is a main element of singing. Articulation is a main element of singing. Lynn Helding has made a very compelling argument that cognitive science should be seen as the third pillar of voice science and voice pedagogy. Most of these words on this slide here come from pedagogy textbooks. So there are many elements of singing. If George Gagnezza is right, or Lamperti is right, and breath is 70 to 80% of singing, then all of these other factors only get about 20 to 30% of the significance. That seems a little weighted incorrectly. And then we can get to this idea that I first, that is discussed at fairly at length in the Vocology textbook by Dr. Titze and Dr. Verdolini Abbott, where they highlight the idea that that the whole singing interaction is interactive. It is nonlinear. So we can't really isolate any one component because all the others are going to be active at the same time. So this idea of doing isolated breathing exercises, that's the one that we could potentially isolate, but is that valuable when the system is interactive? But this also gets at the fact that it doesn't just go from breath to phonation to resonance to articulation to the listener. It's not a linear system. When we change any one of those components, it could change any of the other components. So I like this chart that Matt Edwards uses in his book on rock and roll singing, where we see the linear approach would be breath to phonation to resonance to articulation, and that makes sense. And I think that's why it's promoted sometimes. But there's a reality that when we change any one of those other things, it could have an impact on any one of the previous things, either downstream or upstream. So for instance, if we change our articulation, like if I go from an ah vowel to a very small oo vowel, or an e vowel, which has a very high tongue position, then I am now semi-occluding the vocal tract. That changes the resonance system. That semi-occlusion is going to have a different amount of feedback then on the vocal folds, causing them to vibrate differently than they did with that more open vowel. When the vocal folds are vibrating differently, that's going to impact how much breath is being released. And so we can have this sort of backwards influence because the system is interactive. It is nonlinear. This was talked about in a very specific example on the Vocal Fry podcast. This is part of the NATS sponsored podcast. NATS, of course, the National Association of Teachers of Singing, and they call it Vocal Fry because it happens on Fridays, and it's the nice play on Vocal Fry. It's done by Dr. Nicholas Perna and Sarah Pigeot, and they're both, Nick's in Mississippi, and I forget where Sarah lives now, but she was one of Nick's former students at Mississippi College. And they did 2 episodes specifically on breathing, and one of the main takeaways seems to be that there maybe is an overemphasis on breathing in traditional voice pedagogy. And so again, you don't have to read all of this, but this is a direct quote from that podcast episode, where if we want to sing a longer phrase, if a student is not singing a long phrase, they're running out of breath before they finish the phrase, a lot of times we will say, oh, that must be a breath issue. But Nick points out that in order to sing a long phrase, we have to phonate efficiently. And so you're not going to be able to sing that longer phrase if the problem is with phonation. And so he says in this very graphic way that if you don't have efficient phonation, then putting more exhalatory force against the vocal folds isn't going to help. You're just blowing more air through a flabby glottis. And so, which will probably make the sound even more breathy, or maybe a more forceful kind of breathy. But instead, and he identifies this nonlinear aspect, we can actually fix the resonance shape through the articulatory system to give a more occluded shape that will have more acoustic feedback on the vocal folds, which will encourage greater phonation, perhaps more in the direction of flow phonation, more efficiency there. And so in that way, the resonator can fix the phonator without having to address breath at all. So obviously breath is involved. It's not that it's not a breath issue, but it perhaps is not primarily a breath issue. Kari Reagan talks about this too. I think this is an excellent book that Kari has written. I know she's done some courses for the Voice Study Center here as well, The Systematic Approach to Voice. I think it's a tremendous book. She talks about how singers so desperately want a straightforward explanation about breathing for singing. Obviously, with all of the confusion that's out there, they so desperately want to just be told, here's how you should breathe for singing. Especially when we hear quotes about, you must learn to breathe correctly. And if you don't breathe correctly, then you can't sing correctly, you can't sing in a healthy way. That puts a lot of weight on the breathing process. But as Kari points out, there is no single correct breathing method for singing. There are so many breath management styles, so many breath management strategies, and to acknowledge also that there are many professional level singers in all genres who have found success with seemingly contradictory breath management strategies. So obviously we want to lead our singers to what is going to be the most successful for them, but in doing so, that might involve a lot of individuality and honoring their individuality. So she points out a lot of studies. Thomas Hickson's name comes up a lot when we're talking about breathing and breathing for singing. The late Thomas Hickson was a respiratory physiologist at the University of Arizona. And Kari cites a couple of his studies. In one particular, they interviewed a number of professional singers and had them describe their breath management strategies for singing. And then they used instrumentation to measure how they were breathing when they were singing. And go figure, there was a tremendous disconnect between what those singers thought that they were doing versus what they were actually doing when they measured the actuality versus the way they described their breathing. So obviously then, successful performance does not necessarily mean that you have an accurate understanding about how you are breathing. So when a successful performer says, this is how you should breathe for singing, that's probably what they feel, but we don't necessarily know if that's even what they are doing when they're singing. So these are a couple of colleagues of mine in the Utah Center for Vocology, Dr. Amanda Stark and Dr. Lynn Maxfield, and they wrote a really great summary of anatomy and physiology as well as motor control for breathing in the Journal of Singing back in 2020, a really great article. And they create this useful chart where they identify the muscle, what the muscle does, whether it's primarily a muscle of inhalation or exhalation. They talk about how it's innervated and then also the primary action that it does. So I confirmed with them this asterisk is in the wrong place. It should be here. So the two primary muscles of inhalation are the diaphragm and the external intercostals. There are also a couple of secondary muscles of inhalation. But the two primary ones are the diaphragm, which I think is no surprise to anyone, but also the external intercostals, which I find is often not discussed as much. And then the rest of them listed on this chart are muscles of exhalation. So from the article, they identify again, the diaphragm is primarily the muscle of inhalation, and the result of its motion as it contracts, it moves down and out slowly, or gradually, that it's generally responsible for the feelings of expansion that we have in either the lower thorax or even into the abdomen. Now again, the diaphragm doesn't descend into the abdomen, but because of that motion and the way that it can put pressure on and displace some things in that area, that's where we tend to feel the result of diaphragmatic motion, where many people may feel that result is around in the belly, around the waistline, somewhere lower into the body. And then the external intercostals, they're connected to the ribs, and they're responsible for lifting and spreading the rib cage with some assistance from the secondary muscles of inhalation, like the sternocleidomastoids and the scalenes. So each of those two primary muscles of inhalation tend to be responsible for specific areas of displacement that individual singers may sense more strongly, whether it be a rib cage centered breath or more of an abdominally centered breath. So they talk then about once we start to sing, once we start exhaling, and singing of course is exhaling, that those muscles in inhalation start to just relax. They've done their work, and so they can start to relax. So they are not engaged per se as we start to inhale, other than maybe gradually delaying their amount of engagement. But when they do that, the thorax is decreasing in size, both this way and this way, and that gives a passive elastic recoil which can start our phonation. So without actively engaging muscles, just by relaxing those muscles of inhalation, we may have enough breath to start our sound. And then later in that act of phonation, we might find that we need to more actively engage those muscles of exhalation to maintain the amount of breath pressure needed to sustain the phonation. But initially, and I would say importantly, air starts to move without any muscle contraction. So we're going to look at that more specifically. So when we get into some of these more scientific principles like Boyle's law. So Boyle's law, very briefly, essentially means that pressure and volume are inversely proportional, inversely related, meaning that when one goes up, the other goes down, and vice versa. And it also says that when that the body wants to keep pressures equalized. So when we have an area of high pressure, the air within that area, or within that volume, wants to move to an area where there is lower pressure. And when so when the pressure increases, then it wants to move to some place that is less pressurized. So when we are inhaling, because of the motion of the external intercostals and the diaphragm, the volume, the space within the thorax increases, so the pressure goes down, so air wants to flow in. Then once it starts to decrease, either through that elastic recoil and potentially also through the muscle engagement of the muscles of exhalation, the pressure increases, and so that air wants to flow out. So we've probably heard this to some degree in one place or another. But the Bernoulli principle then has to do with what that air does once it gets through the glottis. So the glottis is a more narrowed aperture than what it's coming from in the trachea. And so Bernoulli says that that air velocity is going to increase once it gets through the glottis. It's going to speed up. And that's the idea that we see with the garden hose, right? The water is flowing at a slowish rate, and then when we partially occlude that, when we make it a narrower opening, then the water has to speed up, and we see that related in the pressure that comes out. So that increase in velocity decreases pressure inside the glottis, and so that glottis cannot stay open anymore, which creates essentially a suction pressure that pulls the vocal folds together. It adducts the vocal folds without us having to muscularly engage any of our vocal fold adductor muscles, any of those intrinsic laryngeal muscles that would do the adduction. So there are principles at place that, depending on how quickly the air is moving through the glottis, that may impact how quickly or the degree of suction pressure that is bringing the vocal folds together. So essentially then, this recoil, which is already decreasing the volume of the thorax, which is increasing the pressure of the air molecules inside the thorax, inside the lungs, is then going to make them want to go to an area of lower pressure, and that's going to create a drop in pressure through the glottis, which is going to bring the vocal folds together. So the combination of those two, again, may be enough to initiate phonation to create the sound that we want without any additional muscular engagement. So therefore, and this is the long way around this whole discussion, if we are overly engaging the muscles of exhalation at the beginning of phonation, then that's going to even further decrease the volume of the thorax, which will increase the pressure of the air inside the lungs, which will increase the velocity of the air through the glottis, which will create a more dramatic drop in pressure, which will have an increased suction force to bring the vocal folds together. So if we are coupling those physical principles with increased muscle engagement as well as adductory force, then I would argue that this could lead to a pressed phonation, which may not be sustainable. So the examples that I think demonstrate this well are the catch breath, right? So a catch breath is an inhalation, and depending, and we've probably all caught ourselves doing this, depending on how quickly you breathe in, it can actually suck the vocal folds together where the inhalation stops. That's the Bernoulli principle at play, is that it just stops that. The other way that I see this at play out in the wild, out in the world, is those hand dryers that you use. Here on campus, we have some very powerful hand dryers in the restrooms. And so I do this thing because I'm a voice nerd, where my hands are getting dried and I bring them close enough together to where the tissues of my hands start vibrating and create a tone. I don't know if anyone else does this. It's like, so you can feel that tone. And if I continue adducting, so making the aperture narrower and narrower, then that phonation stops. So it can get to the point where either through the adductory force or just before my fingers are even touching necessarily, the velocity is such that the suction actually ceases phonation. Now, as a singer, I could overcome that by adding more pressure from the lungs, from the muscles of exhalation, to overcome that stoppage, but it's probably going to mean that there will be a more pressed phonation based on what's happening at the vocal fold level. Now, I have to admit, at this point, had it not been obvious already, that I am not necessarily a voice scientist or physiologist. I have 3 degrees in voice performance. And I try to always be aware and apply the voice science principles when I am able. But luckily, Dr. Inigo Titsa has an office very close to mine. And so when I was putting this talk and these slides together before I presented it the first time, I took it to him and I said, "So does this work? Am I right about this?" And he looked through and he followed my discussion and he's like, "Okay, yeah, I think that's all accurate. I think you got it right." But rightly, he pointed out that this primarily has to do with the onset of sound. All of those principles are at play once we are just beginning sound. But there are different factors at play when we're looking at sustained oscillation, right? A sustained tone. Specifically, if we're looking at self-sustained oscillation, which has some interaction between the supraglottal airway and the vocal folds themselves. Which doesn't necessarily dismiss the idea, because as Scott McCoy reminds us in his book, Your Voice and Inside View, the way that we initiate our sound will certainly have a strong influence on the way we sustain our sound. So if our onset tends to be aspirate, then we are more likely to have a breathy, sustained phonation. If our onset tends to be glottal or pressed or overly adducted, then that will tend to lead to a pressed sound. So, as Amanda and Lynn actually point out here, the ability of our system to use these passive recoil forces actually can reduce the amount of energy that we have to expend when we are singing. So this gets to the idea of support. Is support mean doing something more or doing something less? If we tend to have singers who are overly engaged with those muscles of exhalation, then maybe the right balance for them would be to do less, to use more of those natural recoil forces to start their singing, start their phonation. And Amanda and Lynn say that the wise singers will maximize this efficiency by balancing the passive forces alongside the active forces of breathing. And this is a chart that I reference a lot. It's in Ingo's book, The Principles of Voice Production, where the time of expiration and inspiration is here on the x-axis, lung volume on the y-axis, but he's divided the cycle of expiration, which is phonation, into 3 different phases. So we breathe in here, and then we start phonation. So phonation begins with this first phase, and in order to create our initial sounds, we may only need the elastic recoil forces that are at play from those external intercostals and the diaphragm relaxing and decreasing the volume of the thorax that way. Then once we get into the second of the three phases, the elastic recoil is still at play, but it's not as active because they're getting more to their neutral state. And so that's when we might need to engage more of the internal intercostals, so more of those rib cage oriented muscles of exhalation. And only then when we get to phase 3, when the recoil pressure is gone because they've returned to their natural state, will we potentially need to actually engage those lower abdominal muscles to create that additional force to maintain the same amount of pressure for the tone that we're creating. So I love this image where recoil happens first, then we start to engage a little bit of the muscles of exhalation, and then we get to the lower muscles of abdominal engagement. So again, this seems to counteract the idea that you breathe in and you have to pull in at the lower abdominals immediately once you start to sing. Now there's a caveat that if you want to start with a forceful sound, then maybe you do need a little more of that lower abdominal engagement, more towards the front part of your phases of phonation. Another caveat is that if your body type or just the way that you have taken an inhalation doesn't allow a sufficient enough inhalation, then you won't get as much of the recoil force. So that certainly will play in, and that has to do with who you are and how you're built, but also just the type or the thoroughness, perhaps, of the inhalation that you take. So those factors certainly come in as well. This chart basically says the same thing that I've already discussed. The other contributor to this recoil that I think sometimes is underestimated or maybe isn't written about enough, Kurt Alexander Zeller is one of the co-authors of the What Every Singer Needs to Know About the Body, which is all about body mapping, which gets to the idea of how individuals perceive the way that their voice works, the way that their bodies work, essentially. And if we have an inaccurate picture of how our body works, we tend to encourage our body to work according to the way we think that it works, which may be contrary to the way that it actually works. The image that he uses a lot is, if you believe that your rib cage is a cage, meaning it is static and it does not move during inhalation or exhalation, then most people, when they start thinking about their breathing, are going to hold their rib cage a little more fixed, because that's the image that they have in their mind, as opposed to acknowledging that there is some motion at the rib cage. So what he talked that is pertinent to this discussion in a workshop I took with him and in conversations afterward is he uses that image of the trampoline, right? So if we have a trampoline and you set your foot on the trampoline and you press down, it's going to displace that stretchy material. But then if you gradually lift up on your foot, then the trampoline is going to support it. So you don't need as much activity in the muscle that's lifting your foot, because that stretchy material also wants to get back to its neutral. Only when it gets back to its neutral then do you have to maybe lift your foot all on your own, but you were supported in that action all the way up there. So he says, Kurt Alexander says, that the lower abdominal muscles, the transverse muscles, the oblique muscles, function like this as well. They're muscles of exhalation, so when they engage, they're going to decrease the volume. But when they're relaxed and we breathe in, they're going to stretch out, and so that's going to create some elastic recoil force that is going to want to pull them back to neutral. And then once they get back to neutral, they engage to further decrease the volume. But we don't need to breathe in and then go right to engagement of those muscles. We can use some of the recoil forces before we then use the engagement forces. So I like that image. Lita Scarce also gets at this idea of different breathing strategies for different styles of singing. She says in her manual Singing Voice Rehabilitation that when we're belting can involve a higher degree of TA, thyroarytenoid adduction, a longer closed phase, more of the contact quotient versus the open quotient. Even as we're going into a higher mix, if it's still a belt mix, then the TA might still be in the driver's seat, she says. But that subglottic pressure that we engage in for belting is more through the vocal fold adduction than it is through abdominal pressure, through subglottic pressure pushing up through the glottis. So she says that the amount of abdominal compression is much less in belting than it is for classical singers. And for classical singers who cross over into different styles, that is often surprising to them, how little they need to do in their abdomen, or how little air they need to take in before they make their beltier sounds. So she says one of the ways that we can acknowledge that is when you're breathing for belting, don't take in as much air. Your inhalation posture is going to be a little more static and probably maybe more ribcage oriented and less abdominally oriented. Now, this is especially the case for musical theater singers, many of whom I teach, primarily teach, who are in productions where they're dancing. If you're dancing very actively, or even if you just have very active choreography, you might need to keep those core muscles a little more engaged, a little tighter. That doesn't allow for abdominal expansion as if you were standing still. So you might have to use intentionally a more thoracic component to your breathing, maybe even, God forbid, some clavicular breathing. Costuming factors into that as well. If you're wearing a girdle or some other kind of compression that holds a certain part of your body, then you might have to find ways to manage your breath that are not necessarily as abdominally oriented as classical techniques often promote. So Matt Edwards, whom I referenced before in the rock and roll book, I interviewed him several years ago now about rock and roll singing for a classical singer, and he again cited Thomas Hickson, the respiratory physiologist, and he said that another function of low abdominal breaths is the phenomenon of tracheal pull. So tracheal pull essentially because the lungs are connected to the trachea, and the trachea, the larynx sits on top of the trachea. The lower that we breathe in the body, the more abdominally oriented breath, then it will lower the trachea, which will then lower the larynx, and it will also, in doing so, slightly abduct or slightly pull apart the vocal folds, just on the inhalation phase. And Matt says, well, that's all great for classical singers because that tends to be what you want. You want the vocal folds to be a little more on the edges, and you want that longer vocal tract encouraging the warmer sounds, potentially reaching into that singer's formant quality, singer's formant cluster. But as Matt says, a CCM, a contemporary commercial music, like a belter or a rock pop singer or a musical theater singer, a CCM singer's larynx is generally supposed to be a little bit higher, which creates a shorter vocal tract, which highlights the bright sound of the acoustic spectrum, which is more desirable in more contemporary singing. So breathing low is going to lengthen the vocal tract, so that might actually be the opposite strategy for the sound I'm trying to create. He says also that CCM singers, belters, will carry, as Lita Skeer said, carry more of a chest registration higher than classical singers tend to, probably through more vocal fold adduction, through more TA engagement. And so the vocal folds need to have greater adduction, but Thomas Hickson says that tracheal pull is going to slightly pull the vocal folds apart. So again, from a phonation standpoint, as well as an acoustic standpoint, that abdominal breath may set the system up for a style of singing, for a sound quality that is not necessarily as applicable or as appropriate for music theater belting, rock pop belting. And one of the last elements of this section of the talk then is again quoting Thomas Hickson and some of his research that Ingo references in his book, that our body type may actually have some bearing also into what our technique is for breathing for singing. So that was explored further through an appendix in Matt's book. It was the research by Jennifer Cowgill. The chapter then was written by Christina Howell. And this research identified different body types and the way that they may breathe a little bit differently. So mesomorphs, folks with a more athletic build, will tend to have more high rib cage activity when they inhale and not so much abdominal movement. Larger bodied folks, people who carry a little more body fat, tend to have more abdominal movement in their breathing, and long and lean types, ectomorphs, tend to breathe more high and wide in the chest. So depending, now of course, everyone is beautifully, differently, individually made, and so these are not across the board statements, but these are sort of generalized ideas of how a body type might contribute to what a body does most naturally. So the conclusion they come to is that a breath management style for singing might we might want to allow that to be aligned with a person's physicality, a person's body type. And importantly then, I think one of Howell's conclusions is that if someone is responding appropriately, if their voice is responding to the needs of the music that they're trying to sing, then we might not need to talk about breath at all. We get into a voice situation, and I think when I was an early teacher, breath and posture were the first two things. I would spend lesson after lesson on breath and posture. And now I find I talk about it less and less and less in lessons than I ever have before. Because I'm mindful of this, okay, is what they're doing sufficient for the sound they're trying to be making? But also being mindful of that nonlinear approach. If I hear an issue that 15 years ago, 20 years ago, me would have said, oh, that's a breath issue. Today, me says, well, maybe that's a phonation issue. Maybe I can address resonance that will get at phonation. Maybe I can, maybe it's actually, though it sounds like a breath issue, better addressed through some other component of the singing system. So I will also admit that in my studio, because I work with musical theater singers, and because there are so many different kinds of sounds that are appropriate in musical theater style singing, from a golden age sound, which sounds much more akin to classical singing, to contemporary pop rock style belting, I will try to help students identify where they breathe most naturally. We will then enhance and exploit that as much as we can, but I also encourage them to learn to some degree, to the degree that their body will allow, to breathe in a way that may be less natural for them. If they tend to be a rib cage or chest expander when they breathe, I'm going to encourage them to see how low we can get that breath to feel, so that if they have to sing Golden Age music, they have breathing strategies that will allow that larynx to lower, rather than trying to mechanically depress that muscle or the position of the larynx to create more of a Golden Age type sound. Similarly, if people are abdominal breathers and then they get into a situation where their costuming or the choreography doesn't allow sufficient abdominal motion, then we're going to practice breathing with a more ribcage centered approach, or maybe even clavicular if that's what they're allowed to do. So I think it's worth honoring, acknowledging, building upon what they do most naturally, but then also encouraging a development of what they don't do as naturally, so that they have more options of strategies that they can choose when they are in those situations. So once more back to Amanda and Lynn's article, they say that we have to understand that every person has different capacities based on how they are built, and so there will probably be a lot of individuality in breathing for singing, something that Kari acknowledged as well, that there is no one correct method of breathing for singing. So these takeaways, yes, Lamperti says the foundation of all vocal study lies in the control of the breath. I'm not going to say no, I'm going to say perhaps, but there may be, if control means muscle action, muscle interaction, then maybe there is more of that going on. Maybe there's less of that. Maybe we need less of that than we have traditionally thought, or maybe how we have been taught. Another major takeaway, I think, is that when our students are confused, if they don't understand what support means, if they don't understand what their most ideal breath management strategy might be, then it probably means they're going to work too hard. And in singing, so much of the time the goal is balance. It is not hypofunction or hyperfunction. And so if this leads them out of balance in the degree of hyperfunction, then we're not meeting our goals. So if they are not clear, they're probably going to trend toward hyperfunction. Also acknowledging the non-linearity of the singing system. So we acknowledge that not everything that maybe has been perceived as an issue with breath necessarily needs to be addressed by breath. Even if it is potentially a breath issue, it might also be addressed through a different component of the nonlinear system, maybe by changing the resonance system, maybe by intentionally doing something different from like a registration issue with what's going on at the phonatory mechanism. There are many ways that we can address different issues because it is nonlinear and they're all interactive. If we are changing styles, then when we are belting in particular, the way that we breathe in might be less abdominally oriented. It might be more static. For classical singers, we may have to remind them when they are singing in beltier styles that you just don't need to take in that much air. It's not that a singer's breath is, it's that is a way that you can breathe to create a particular kind of sound. If you're intending to belt, that kind of breath may be more inhibitory than facilitating. And then as Amanda and Lynn point out, that wise singers will maximize the passive forces, specifically the recoil of all of what's going on in the system, before we then resort to the active forces of engaging those muscles of exhalation as we sing. Ingo points out, though, that if we can't expand enough, then we're not going to get as much recoil force. So maybe those long lean types, they'll get a little bit of recoil, but if they're not able to expand sufficiently or as much as other body types might, they're not going to have as much recoil. So they may actually need to engage in some muscular engagement sooner than other people to create sufficient pressure to make the sounds that they're intending. And then importantly and lastly on this topic, my teacher, Bob Harrison, also reminds us that as artists, the inhalation is part of the performance. The inhalation is part of the communication process. So if we are taking breaths that are inspired, if our inspiration is inspired by the desire to communicate a thought, an idea, an emotion, then that may also be sufficient to power the communication that we follow through with once we start to phonate. So some people refer to that as a vocal affect. If you breathe with the affect of sobbing or joy or anything, any emotion that you might want to communicate, if we breathe with the emotion of that, then it may be sufficient to power the sound that we are communicating. So that is the completion of the respiration section. This is a great time to pause if anyone has any questions or would like to discuss anything on this topic before we head into the next one. Is there anything anyone would like to throw out?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for the first section so far. I'm really curious to understand a bit more how the breath, if we take a deeper breath or sort of further down, that impacts on the larynx position. Just keen to understand that a bit more.
Sure. So the phenomenon is called tracheal pull. So you could look it up. I know Johan Sundberg has written about this as other people. Tracheal pull. But it again essentially is just that the lungs are connected to the trachea and the larynx sits right on top of the trachea. So when we breathe in a way that is more abdominally oriented, it's putting more pressure in the downward motion rather than the outward motion. And so that, because of that motion, it's going to pull the whole system down. So because of that, the larynx is going to lower in the throat. You know, we kind of do it when we yawn. We yawn and that larynx lowers, and that's going to create a longer vocal tract, which is why when we talk, when we're trying to suppress a yawn, our voice gets warmer or gets darker, right? So for classical singers, ah, toreador. But if you're trying to sing, I learned to slam on the brakes, ah, that's a higher larynx position. So if I am breathing abdominally before I'm singing Dear Evan Hansen, then I'm going to pull the larynx down through the way that I breathe, but then I'm going to have to bring the larynx back up so that I can make that shorter vocal tract so I can sing the bright sounds that are required for that style of singing. So that's essentially what's going on, is the tracheal pull phenomenon and how it impacts the length of the vocal tract.
Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Great question.
I also have one question. Do you find that it differs between like male, female, and transgender voices in terms of like breathing styles and kind of that really narrow sort of musical theater sound?
It can. You know, again, the idea is that we're honoring where people are and their individuality. So, and also being mindful of what sounds they're intending to create, right? So if you want to make this kind of sound, if someone sings a tone that is that they're perfectly happy with, then some of my job is to not get in the way of that. I find that a lot with my transgender singers. There are some who want to explore the full range of everything that their voices can do. Others very much don't want to explore a certain part of their range and want to do more to build and exploit other parts of their range. So I think that our strategies can be tailored to the particular sound goals that they have, right? So male, female, it depends again depending on the genre that they're singing. But if we kind of know the principles of this is likely to lead to that outcome, right? Then, so for someone who wants to have a lower, boomier sound, then tracheal pull, it might be a really good way to get that, because now you can warm up your sound just by laryngeal position. And so I would hope to encourage that singer to do that most efficiently, so that it doesn't become a pressed sound, it doesn't become overly fatiguing. Knowing again that tracheal pull is a passive way because it's happening from underneath to create a longer vocal tract, then that could be a really good strategy. For someone who wants to have a higher laryngeal position and a brighter sound quality, then perhaps a more ribcage or even clavicular centered way of inhalation might facilitate that, because they're not going to be constantly lengthening their vocal tract in a way that's going to warm up their sound. So the short answer, too late for that, is that it depends on the sounds that they're trying to make. But if we have an understanding of this strategy is going to likely lead to this result, then I can better facilitate the person in front of me to create the sounds that they're looking for.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else before we go on to the next? And obviously if something comes up later, we can address that. But great, well, we'll keep moving. So the next topic for discussion then is placement. And this section is called Finding the Right Place for Placement. And a lot of my ideas, I believe this article was shared with you, come from this article that I wrote for the Journal of Singing a few years ago on that same title. So when we look at what placement is or how it is defined, Matthew Hoke is a professor at Auburn University, has written a number of textbooks, and in this dictionary that he compiled several years ago, he talks about placement as being prevalent. Voice teachers, singers use that term a lot, but it's also very subjective, partly because the perception of placement is sensation-based, and our sensations are very different from person to person. So this is almost comically explored through this book, Master Singers, Advice from the Stage. The authors, Donald George and Lucy Morrow, interviewed a number of current successful operatic singers to see what they use, kind of like the Thomas Hickson study on breathing. But it was just interviews. And so Alan Held says, placement is the most important aspect of my singing, but Thomas Hampson says, oh, I don't use that word. Kathleen Kim says, I don't try to place the sound, I just try to feel the sensation. And for me, that sensation when I'm singing is in the back of my throat. But Eric Owens says, oh, I never feel it in the back of my throat. If anything, it's maybe like out the top of my head, but also with some forward placement. He says again that the resonance, the placement, for me is mostly in the front and in the mask. And Jonas Kaufmann says, I do not feel the voice in the mask. So already from these professional, very successful singers, there is a variety of how they use the word, what that means for them, what sensations it elicits, and then even some people who don't use the term. So even back in the 60s, William Vennard, one of our early, mid-20th century pedagogues, says that he was already chiding kind of the placement people. So even back then, people were saying, oh, we shouldn't use placement. He says there are a lot of people who say that placement is a myth because you can't direct your tone anywhere. Tone is going to go into all the cavities that it can. It's going to vibrate lots of different bones in your head and your body. And he says, well, of course, yes, all of this is true. And he again chides the scoffers who are sarcastically remarking that you can't resonate up here unless your brain pan is empty. And he's like, okay, all right, people, calm down. I think that we can admit that there is some validity to the imagery of placement perhaps as a teaching aid. And we can use that probably without getting into the pitfall of literalism to make people believe that sound is actually going somewhere or resonating in a place where it maybe isn't. So I really like the way that Scott McCoy talks about this. I've referenced him already. He wrote a chapter called Singing and Voice Science that is in all 21 of the books of the So You Want to Sing series, published by Rowman and Littlefield, sponsored by the National Association of Teachers of Singing. And in that chapter, he distinguishes between forced resonance and free resonance. So forced resonance he calls our private resonances. These are the vibrations that we individually feel in different areas of our body. And importantly, since these are internal vibrations, they can have a really profound impact on how we perceive our own voices. But because they are so internal, that they don't result in, they're not creating the sound waves that our listeners are hearing. This is in contrast to free resonance, which is most often what I think we're talking about when we're talking about resonance for singing. We're talking about how sound travels through spaces, specifically the vocal tract, and how that sound is impacted, changed, enhanced certain areas, other areas are dampened, how that changes. And that is the sound that does reach our listeners, and that is what gives us all our own individual timbre or voice quality. And Scott doubles down on this in his other book, where he says it really depends on how you are built, on your personal physiognomy. And so based on how you are built, you might experience feelings of tone placement, feelings of forced resonance in any of these areas, maybe in the mask, maybe in the top of your head. And though these sounds can be helpful to individual singers because they give you reference points, I think, for your singing, he says they're not as reliable when we use them for teaching because they are not universally experienced. So in other words, from all of that, forced resonance creates sensations that we as individual singers should identify and are often well served to use proactively. But those sensations are not the same from person to person. So I shouldn't expect that my students will feel their sound the same way that I feel it. My teacher shouldn't expect me to feel my sound the way that they do. None of my students should expect that the way they feel their sound should be the way that anyone else in the studio feels their sound. And sometimes I use this only somewhat facetious phrase where I say, let's just all agree that you are never wrong to feel what you feel. That's both a singing lesson and a life lesson. Let's acknowledge what we all feel, and then we can make choices to act either in accordance with that or to try to do something different. But we can acknowledge where we feel things, where we feel our sound, and it is not wrong. Richard Miller, I think, points out the chicken or the egg phenomenon when it comes to placement, which really is essentially, is placement an action? Is it something that we do, or is placement the result of something? So he admits that that singers should rely on these sensations. They should self-monitor their singing, and they should be aware of where their sensations are when they're singing. But he says those sensations should be the result of a coordinated function, not attempting to put sound in places where it just can't go. And what I find is when my students are placing their sound, if they think of placement as an action rather than the result of coordinated function, this is a lot of what I see. They start scrunching their nose, they start sneering their lips, they start squinting or furrowing their brow, or maybe even they like tilt their head forward. It's like, getting my sound forward, So they start doing all these things trying to make placement an action. They're trying to place rather than creating a well-coordinated system and then saying, now that this system is well-coordinated, where do I feel my sound? And identifying that. So this is the game that I play, and I discuss it in the article, is we explore where people may actually feel their own forced resonance. Again, acknowledging that there will be individual differences. Very often I will ask a student, well, where did you feel that when you sang? And they'll say, well, I know I'm supposed to feel it here. And I say, that is not what I asked. I didn't say, where do you think you are supposed to feel it? I asked where you actually feel it. And if they haven't done this exploration, this is where we'll go there. And so I'll have them put their hand right here. And I'll say, let's sing on a I'll have them in a fairly limited range, but with changing pitch, go up and down. I also use a hum because it traps more of the sound inside, which seems to increase the sensation of forced resonance. And so I'll say, do you feel anything there at your hand? Most of the time we'll say yes. And I'll say, how strongly? Do you feel it strongly, faintly, somewhere in between? And they'll give me an answer. And I'll say, okay, cool. Now let's do it on a ee. Do you still feel it there? Often they say yes. Say, do you feel it as strongly, not as strongly? Sometimes when they open to a vowel, they don't feel it as strongly, but they can still recognize that they feel sensations there. So then I'll say, okay, we've just identified an area where you can feel sound. There is actual vibration happening. It is sympathetically vibrating this sternum area with the vibrations of the vocal folds. So that's something that exists. We don't have to deny that. But now here's the next part. Take your hand away and go back to the hum and see if you can feel those sensations only through your internal proprioception. And then we have that same discussion. Can you still feel them? Often they say yes. Are they as strong as when you were using your hand there? Say, no, not as strong, but they're still pretty noticeable. Cool. Did it change as you were going higher versus going lower? Well, sometimes when I went higher, I didn't feel them as strongly. Great. Let's recognize that. Let's acknowledge that. Okay, now put your hand across your throat. And we do the same goal. People say, well, I know I'm not supposed to feel my sound in my throat. I'm like, well, that's funny because the vocal folds are pretty much connected to this front part of your thyroid cartilage right there. And so that's where the vibration is actually happening. So I think you would be wrong not to feel your sound there to some degree. Like, oh, okay. And so then we play that whole game, do it on a hum, do it on a vowel, go up and down in pitch, take your hand away, do it on a hum, do it on a vowel, go up and down in pitch, see if you can still identify. And now they're starting to pay attention, not just to the internal vibrations, but to localized internal vibrations. And then we just keep going up the chain. Sometimes I'll just do the jaw. Sometimes I'll do like the lady in the picture where you have your hand across the whole front of your face and ask them to be aware you've got some parts of your hands that are touching your cheekbones, some are touching your jaw, some are touching like the middle part of your skull, anything like that. And we do the same thing and we see what they do. Sometimes they go to the bridge of the nose. And obviously when they're on the on any of the nasalized consonants, they tend to feel a lot of vibrations here, unsurprisingly. And then they go to the E. Oh, I don't feel them as much there, but I might still feel a little bit. Great, so we play that game, we take the hands away, we do the same thing on the forehead, we do the same thing on the top of the head, maybe even the back of the head, just to acknowledge that there are many places where they can feel sound, and they are not wrong, they are never wrong to feel what they feel. So the other one that I will sometimes use, Richard Miller mentioned, is, but we can't do it with the vibrotactile of the hand, is I say, now put your attention to the roof of your mouth, right? So I don't even get specific and say hard palate, soft palate, alveolar ridge, I just say the roof of your mouth. And then that allows them to identify without localizing yet. And so we'll do the hum, a lot of times they'll close their eyes on the internal sensation to try to find, which I encourage. And then we can get more specific about, oh, I could feel some vibrations there. Okay, where? Was it in the middle? Was it towards the back? Was it all the way at the teeth? So once we've identified all those places, then we can get specific and say, okay, now let's sing a phrase, even if it's just ah, sing a phrase, but see if you can place your attention, place your focus, not place your sound, place your attention on one of those places that we just identified where you already have some sensation of forced resonance. Now, let's change to a different place. And we'll observe, how did your sound change? How did your sound quality change when your focus was in one place? Because if they were just singing from, for instance, roof of the mouth sensation, ah, for beginning singers to maintain a focus of sensation versus a ah, where the sound sensation, I don't know how well that translates over Zoom, but where the sound sensation probably changes versus maintaining a point of focus, that can sometimes be surprising for them. So once we, again, and if someone has identified, I don't feel anything here, then I will never again mention, or probably never again mention, let's see if we can focus on the sound here. If they have told me that they don't have strong sensation there, especially if it's on a vowel, then that's not a useful point of reference. But if they say, oh, I feel it really strongly at the top of the head, we'll come back to that a lot. Okay, put your hand up here, and we'll use the vibrotactile again. Use your hands to find that, and then go back to the internal. Now sing this phrase on words or on changing vowels, and it's honoring what your voice does without me imposing, well, this is how I feel my voice, or this is how I was told I should feel my voice, so therefore you should place your sound. So in this way, we don't have to throw out the word placement, though it's still tricky. I don't love it when people use it. But if we're clear that what they are placing is their focus or their attention, and if that is in an area that they have already identified where they can feel some forced resonance, some sensation, then that's something we can exploit, we can build upon, and that becomes a really important frame of reference. So let's pause again. Any comments, questions, thoughts, or ideas related to placement? Once again, the article is shared with you. It goes through in, I don't know if it's greater or lesser detail, but you have that with you. So if any of you want to explore that further, the ideas are there. Excellent. We'll keep going. We're making great time. 2 more sections in about 45 minutes. Okay, so this is the next section and this is borrowed from a presentation that Lynn and I gave at the International Physiology and Acoustics of Singing conference. It was a virtual conference, but it was initially hosted in Europe, I think in Germany, and then they ended up not being able to host it, so there was a Brazil company that came in and hosted it, but then it was still on the Germany time, so I ended up presenting at like 6 a.m., which is really early to try to understand physiology and acoustics, I have found. But there was a lot of coffee that day. So this is the idea of the talk was how we can use SOVTs, or semi-occluded vocal tract exercises, as a vocal tract reset. So specifically how it impacts the vocal tract. So a lot of that was also reflected in this paper that our Utah Center for Vocology team put out on how vocalization with semi-occluded airways is favorable for optimizing our sound production. And that was Ingo and team et al. I would be the al way down here at the end, but hey, that counts. So, as a very quick review, I assume most of you are somewhat at least familiar with semi-occluded vocal tract exercises. If not, then I'm happy to be the one to present them to you. So SOVT stands just for that, semi-occluded vocal tract. Now we tend to think of the vocal tract as the resonating space for the voice. So a lot of people will talk about it as the distance from the vocal folds to the lips. But I prefer to say the distance from the vocal folds to where the sound exits, because if your soft palate or velum is not entirely lifted, then the nasal cavity may then become part of the vocal tract if sound is actually being resonated in the vocal tract. So that's why I prefer to say the distance from the vocal folds to where the sound exits. And nasality, again, can be a choice, especially if you're singing in multiple genres. So that's what the vocal tract is. Semi-occluded literally means to partially or partly block. It's partly closed, partly occlude. So an SOVT is essentially a partially closed vocal tract. Now there are many ways that you can partially close the vocal tract, and partially closed, I would say, compared to an open vowel. So let's say like an ah. So if you go from an ah to a now you are semi-occluding, you're partially blocking the vocal tract, because sound is no longer coming through that open mouth space, it's only coming through the nares of the nose, which is a smaller or a more occluded area. We can go from an ah to a Now the lips are vibrating, the sound is coming through the lips, but it's in a smaller aperture than an open mouth. Some of the ones that are very popular, getting a lot of play in research and in studios, is singing into straws of different sizes, right? And the diameter of the straw makes a difference as to whether that occlusion is greater or smaller. So, now the sound is coming through this tiny opening instead of through the open mouth. So those are many of the ways that we can occlude the vocal tract. Now, why would you want to do this? Well, Ingo Tietze, my colleague here in Utah, is one of the leaders in the research in this area. So there's a lot out there, and it's been around for since, about the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s. And so these are some of the benefits that we know that SOVT exercises can have on phonation, on the way that the vocal folds are vibrating. So it tends to decrease our phonation threshold pressure. That means how much lung pressure it takes to get the vocal folds to vibrate. So if it takes a lot of force to get the vocal folds to vibrate, that's going to tend to result in a larger amplitude and a greater collision force at the vocal fold level. That could be a more fatiguing way to sing. So it will be less fatiguing, so maybe more efficient, if by using SOVTEs we can lower that phonation threshold pressure, so it takes less lung pressure to get the vocal folds to vibrate. They're therefore not going to come together with such force. Their amplitude isn't going to be as great, so it will create greater, what Tietze and Anna-Maria Laukkanen refer to as greater vocal economy. There's lower collision force, but also an increased energy. So we get more output, more acoustic output without increasing our effort. Marco Guzman is another significant researcher in this area. I encourage you to look up the articles that they have written. Tietze, Laukkanen, Guzman, Apfelbach, all the folks here. And there were a couple of fairly recent summary articles, one in the Journal of Voice and one in the Journal of Singing, that go into much greater detail about the benefits. But this is how I often hear SOVT exercises talked about, is how they impact the way that we phonate, which is significant. And I use them in my studio to address those issues all the time, and I find them very effective. But singing SOVT exercises also impact the shape of our vocal tract. And one of these studies, Laukkanen found that the mid-sagittal area of the vocal tract, the pharyngeal area, increased, and there was greater velar closure. So it tended to lift the soft palate in addition to increasing space in the pharynx. Guzman found that in a couple of his own studies, that there was more pharyngeal widening, but there was also a laryngeal lowering, right? So we talked about tracheal pull, lower abdominal breaths as a way to passively lower the larynx without engaging the muscles that depress the larynx. Well, singing into SOVTE, I would say especially probably with higher resistance SOVTs, so smaller openings, might result in a passive laryngeal lowering that we might then be able to bring into our singing without the SOVT implement. Brad Story has found similar things, similar trends in a single subject, and Guzman also found a narrowing of the epilaryngeal tube. So that's that area right above the vocal tract, right above the larynx. Ingo now prefers to refer to that as the larynx canal, because it's not really a tube, it's sort of open. In some areas, depending on where the constriction is happening, it can be more open, but also because it has similar diameters to the ear canal. So if you hear epilaryngeal tube or epilarynx or larynx canal, it's all essentially referring to the same area. But the narrowing of the epilaryngeal tube, sometimes we think of narrowing as a bad thing, but narrowing in that area, which comes often through training, is what is believed by many to contribute to the boost in the upper harmonics of our acoustic spectrum, which gives us a brighter sound. For classical singers, that could result in that singer's formant cluster that allows folks to be heard over an orchestra. For belter singers, it allows to get a acoustic spectrum that creates a belt-like sound without relying so much on vocal fold adduction. So that can be a very desirable thing that happens as a result of singing with an SOVT, is that narrowing of the epilarynx. So here's what we know as voice teachers, is that different styles of singing, different genres of singing, may require different combinations of vocal tract shapes. And these textbooks that are mentioned below all essentially discuss these generalities, that classical singing involves a longer vocal tract, usually accomplished through a lower larynx, a wider pharyngeal position, while also having that narrow epilarynx. But if we're singing commercial music, like musical theater or pop rock, that generally involves a shorter vocal tract, so we're probably going to have a narrower or a higher larynx, we're going to have a narrower space in the pharynx, we're going to have more jaw opening, more opening at the lips, but we're also going to have that narrow epilarynx that we would have in classical singing. So what we found, though, through other research, is that the muscles, Joe Estel talks about the muscles that shape our vocal tract had different activation when people were belting compared to when they were using classical singing. Manternach and his team found that belting also had different vocal tract shapes than head voice singing did, very similar to what we already discussed from those textbooks. Marcelo Saldias found that twang-like singing, this is a single subject, but a twang-like singing had that increased lip opening, jaw opening, a higher larynx, less horizontal length of the vocal tract. And of course, Johan Sundberg, Brian Gill was involved in that study. Actually, Brian Gill led the study and Sundberg was involved in it as well, but they found that a little bit of an opening at the velopharyngeal port, meaning a soft palate that is not lifted as high as it can go, but if there's a little space for sound to get into the nasal cavity, that can actually boost the 2,000 to 4,000 hertz range of our singing. So that's right around that area of the singer's formant cluster. So we can use lots of different combinations of narrowings and openings depending on whether you're singing classically or head voice dominant, whether you're singing twang, whether you're singing belting, whether you're trying to create a singer's formant cluster or not trying to create that singer's formant cluster. This really fascinating study Marcelo Saldias did, he looked at one belter, contemporary commercial music belter, and then 4 additional subjects who had hyperfunctional dysphonia. All 5 of them, the belter was perfectly healthy vocally. But all 5 of those subjects had very similar larynx positions that was high, very similar oropharyngeal widths, epilaryngeal outlets, and pharyngeal outlets, or pharyngeal inlets. But the belter, in addition to those narrowings, had a wider lip opening and a wider jaw opening. So too much narrowing in too many places could be a characteristic of hyperfunctional dysphonia, but the same narrowings, along with a particular widening, in this case the lips and the mouth, might just be belting. So depending on where you're trying to open and where you're trying to narrow could lead to hyperfunction potentially, or just appropriate function for a particular genre of music. So one of our goals then as singing teachers is we have to help our singers understand which areas need the narrowing and which areas need the opening, depending on the sounds they're trying to create. And that might depend on genre. Not that we necessarily are going to tell them to narrow certain or constrict certain areas, but if that's the result of what they need to create, then we need to be mindful of that. Now here's the problem, is that most of the muscles that we have in the vocal tract and around the vocal tract are constrictors or narrowers, and they are not wideners. And some places need to be wider. So generally we have the narrowing, constricting muscles of the pharyngeal constrictor muscles. These are the muscles that engage to help bring food, water, liquids down into the stomach. And so they are constrictors, they narrow space. Oftentimes people feel like they are opening the throat, but what they're actually doing is pulling the tongue back, which might give a sensation of openness in the oral cavity, but is probably narrowing the pharynx. So the sensation of an open throat probably also involves a narrowing into the pharynx. Ken Bozeman talks about this really brilliantly in his second version of the Kinesthetic Voice Pedagogy book about remapping the open throat. So since there are hardly any muscles that expand the pharynx, that actually open the throat, because most of those muscles are narrowers or constrictors, that can lead to a kinesthetic misperception, false kinesthesia, I believe he calls it. And the muscles that open the throat generally are not even located in the throat. So one of the ways that we open the throat is to relax the narrowers. Just don't allow the narrower muscles to engage. That keeps a more open-throated feeling. We can lift the soft palate, but that happens above. We can lower the larynx, but that tends to happen below. We can front the tongue. Those are the things that we can do that open the throat, but not in the traditional way that we think of engaging a muscle to open the throat within the vocal tract. So this is part of what we discussed in our paper, is that when we use oral pressures, such as can be accomplished by using semi-occluded vocal tract exercises, it tends to passively, through those air pressures, oral pressures, passively widen all of the airways. That tends to be a real benefit for phonation. So we can, in addition to passively widening those the airway, it tends to spread apart those upper parts of the vocal folds so that the phonation aspect is benefited. We can often, especially trained singers, will tend to prevent that epilaryngeal area from expanding during SOVT exercises. So if we can keep that narrow, so we get the really good high harmonics, and we get really good, as Ingo describes it, source airway impedance matching, in addition to opening, then that may allow us to more selectively choose the areas that we do want to narrow while maintaining a degree of openness in other spaces. So this is sort of the conclusion of all that. Since SOVT exercises increase that supraglottic air pressure and uniformly expand the airway, the vocal tract, then we hypothesize that this can really serve as a vocal tract reset. So if we have any unintended constrictions, any habitual constrictions, this can alleviate all of that by blowing up the whole system. I think this is especially useful for singers who sing in multiple genres, who do a lot of cross training. I'm going to sing classically, now I'm going to sing belty, now I'm going to go back and sing Golden Age musical theater, now I'm going to sing rock pop. If you're going back and forth through all of those sounds in a single session, then there might be some subconscious carrying over of some of the constrictions and openings of this genre that might impact your ability to do this genre. So this reset may help us do essentially that, reset the system, so that then we can allow for greater wide-narrow contrasts when we can come from that neutral reset and then specifically find the wide-narrow combinations that our new style of voicing requires. So which SOVT should we use? Which exercise? We mentioned a couple of these already, the nasal consonants, singing into a drinking straw, singing into a stirring straw, lip trill. This is a study that Lynn and Ingo, as some others, did that found the degree of intraoral pressure that is created by some of these various SOVT exercises. These would tend to be the higher resistance, so they're going to have less airflow. These tend to be lower resistance, so they're going to have a little more airflow. So you could just look and say, well, these are probably going to be the most effective. But some other studies that myself and some colleagues and other folks have done have found that people did find an advantage in using SOVT exercises, but the type of exercise, whether that's a lip trill or a drinking straw or a stirring straw or whatever, nasalized consonants, it varied. The one that they preferred sort of varied from person to person. So we have to do, as voice teachers, sometimes some sleuthing to find which SOVT is going to be the most useful or most beneficial for individual students. I will use different SOVTs depending on what I'm trying to accomplish. So when I am intentionally trying to use the SOVT as a vocal reset, the one that I really like to use is called the blowfish. So Marcy Rosenberg writes about this in the Vocal Athlete application sort of workbook that comes along with the Vocal Athlete textbook. That's where I first learned about it, where essentially you've all seen the blowfish, right? They puff up. And so I encourage my singers to do this with puffy cheeks, but also a sense of puffiness around the lips. I also encourage them to feel like their whole head is blowing up or expanding, not like blowing up, but expanding. So there might be a sense of opening in the back half of the mouth as well. So this is an SOVT because the sound is just coming out through that very small opening at the mouth. Marcy, I believe in her article, talks about also moving the tongue around to avoid any sort of tongue depression. So you can actually move that around while singing da 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 da. So if you're doing it well, it sounds sort of like you're underwater or like you're a cartoon character or something. But I like that one especially. So when I'm taking singers through their vocal exercises and we're going between, now these are your really chest dominant belty sounds. Now we're going to do your soprano head voice type sounds. Okay, now we're going to go to a real mix in between. When I'm going back and forth, I think part of our training is the forgetting of what we had done and then learning to rediscover the new thing. And so I think the reset can serve really well, and the blowfish can serve really well as we go between exercises, because it allows them to kind of forget the previous thing, take on the new thing without any holdover from the previous thing that they were doing. So once again, we think of phonation as being the primary way that SOVTs benefit us in singing, and that impact is significant, and I use SOVTs for that purpose often, every day, if not in every lesson to some degree, some kind of SOVT exercise. But this is I find a lesser discussed benefit of singing that I think is particularly beneficial for those who cross over genres, is the vocal tract reset aspect. And I think that's basically what I just said. So once we use that as a reset, we can alleviate any of those unintended constrictions as we're traversing styles, and then we can go back to that sort of fresh approach when we go in and decide which areas of the vocal tract we want to intentionally narrow and which ones we want to have intentionally expanded as we're creating all sorts of different types of sound. So that's the end of the third of fourth sessions of the talk. So any questions, comments, experiences related to SOVTs? I see this comment in the chat. If you were using SOVTs to target a deeper sounding voice quality, is the idea to internalize the posture as it would be when breathing through a narrow straw? First of all, let me clarify that it's not breathing through the straw, it's vocalizing through the straw. So it's not an inhalation, it's a right? Yeah. So I think that's a really good way to do it, right? Because any series of pitches, any exercise, because it is a nonlinear system, could be addressing any number of things. So if I want to use the straw specifically for traversing the passaggio, then I'm going to call someone's attention to that probably. Let's sing through the straw and see how smoothly you can get through the passaggio. Now, it may have all those other benefits or all those other impacts that we just talked about. It's going to cause the vocal folds to lower the phonation threshold pressure. It's probably going to widen the pharynx, all of those kinds of things. But if we're using it for smoothing the passaggio, then I want to draw the singer's attention to that, so they understand what the purpose of the exercise is, so they know how to execute it. And sometimes that only means putting their intention to that aspect. So similarly, I think if you wanted to use the straw for lowering the larynx, creating a longer vocal tract, I think you could, I wouldn't say lower the larynx, but I would say sing into the straw and put your hand on your larynx and see if it changes. Does it change when you get higher or lower, when you sing louder or softer? And if they notice, oh, it seems like the larynx went down a little bit, then okay, well, let's see if we can maintain that position then as you go from the SOVT into a vowel. So they create that lowering and then they just maintain the lowering. that's part of what we don't know yet, or hasn't been sufficiently studied in the research, to my understanding, is how long the effect that we get from singing into an SOVT maintains once you remove the implement, right? So that's why I like to go immediately back and forth. So yes, I think I would call their attention to what's happening so that they can internalize that, so that they also know that that's one of the purposes of the exercise. And then I would also monitor to make sure they didn't, as good students often do, then take that to an extreme and, oh, I'm singing, so now they start to actually lower the larynx before, or they start to do, it becomes a muscular thing. And so we have to be monitoring that and say, okay, now don't try to lower the larynx, just let the straw do the work. So that's part of how I would address that question. Other comments or questions related to the SOVT component?
Hiya, I don't know if I'm unmuted. Hiya, I just wanted to ask in regards to working on the passaggio through a straw exercise. I have a lady who I'm specifically doing this with at the moment. Could you give some tips on that? Because she uses basically a lot of breath pressure. Breathing has been her thing, but yeah, she uses a lot of breath, and she finds when she basically does it, she's like, I don't really know what I'm doing, and she tenses. And could you give me some tips on that, please?
Yeah, sure. It's amazing because it is so individualized, right? And I find that for some people, you know, a drinking straw works really well at smoothing out the passaggio, and they're like, wow, it was so smooth. And for other people, it does the complete opposite, and the passaggio is more exposed than without the straw. So I'm like, well, how does that work? What's going on there? So I think for passaggio, I think generally the issue is we need a higher flow more than a higher resistance one. And you know, colleagues may disagree on this, but that's how I find the most success with them in the studio. So if someone is over pressurizing and it's exposing the passaggio, then I would go further down on that chart of intraoral pressure. So I would go to nasals, I would go to things like a small oo vowel as opposed to like an ah vowel, yeah. Or even, you know, a wide opening straw. There are even straws that are wider than a drinking straw, like a bubble straw or something. Or you can, you know, Marco Guzman has used tubes, you know, or you can go to the hardware store and get tubes of all different diameters. So you can get a wider tube to find what sort of works better. I like also the breath flowy ones like the lip trill or the raspberry. So if they're overpressurizing, I would say let's err on something that has less resistance and more flow. So something that is wider. So maybe a slightly wider straw than you're using with this particular person, or maybe some of those that are more airflow based. Great. Any other questions or comments? We have one more section, and it's probably the shortest section, but otherwise, we can head into that, and there should be times for questions where obviously I'll entertain questions on any of these topics or unrelated topics. I think my brother was part of this a while ago, so if any of you saw Jeremy Manternach's presentation, if you just want to gossip about him, we can do that as well. I'll give you all the dirt on Dr. Jeremy. He's just my little brother. It's still hard for me to call him doctor. Okay, so this is the last component, is reconsidering the master-apprentice model. So this again gets at sort of traditional tactics, how we are taught, how maybe we have been taught, and how we may be changing or evolving our way of thinking related to this particular model. So I have to highlight, I agreed to this talk months before this article came out. It just came out in the most recent Journal of Singing, but I wanted to highlight it. It's because it talks directly about this, and some of what I'm going to talk about is mentioned in this article. So I encourage you to check that article out by Travis Sherwood, and I'm really thrilled to see that this topic is getting even greater play and greater attention in our singing circles. So much of what I'm going to talk about kind of comes from, or I learned, or is highlighted in William Sauerland's really wonderful book, Querying Vocal Pedagogy, highly recommended. Billy, they go by. And so Billy highlights a couple of studies that specifically looked at this. The one is way back from 2006, where the investigators observed 3 master teachers, artist level teachers at prominent conservatories in the United States, and they sort of found characteristics that they referred to as following a master-apprentice model or a teacher-centered pedagogy. And so some of those characteristics involve where the teacher is the one who sets the structure for the lesson, right? The student comes in and the teacher says, here's what we're going to do. The teacher sets the goals, both for the lesson, but also for the student. The student's like personal goals for singing. The teacher is is who paces the lesson, says we're going to work on exercise until I say we're going to move on to repertoire. And then once you do get to repertoire, it's often the teacher who makes all the repertoire assignments. Often, as they found in their observations, these teachers would use negative feedback quite frequently, and positive feedback only infrequently, only occasionally. Another study that Billy highlights is that often applied music instructors will simply default to this teacher-centric approach because it's what they know, because it's the way that they were taught probably, and so that is the way that we just associate a teacher-centric pedagogy with pedagogy, right? It's like low breathing is breathing for singing. It's like, well, that's breathing for a specific kind of singing perhaps, but so teacher-centered pedagogy is a pedagogy, but we tend to default to it thinking that it is the pedagogy. So my colleague Lynn Maxfield here at UCV, when we're addressing this positive feedback versus negative feedback, he highlights several studies cited below here that have indicated that when we focus on positive feedback, it actually improves learning. When we focus on the positive outcome, so when a student does something 3 or 4 times in a row and we say, oh, number 2 and number 3 were really good. What did you do there? As opposed to saying number 1 and number 4 didn't really work. They didn't land. What went wrong? We focus on what was successful and what is being accomplished versus drawing their attention to what was not successful. It actually improves learning. In one of these studies, they said that positive feedback actually increased, part of why it was successful is that it increased the learner's perception of their own competence, their ability to do the thing, their self-efficacy, you might say. So their competence, they feel better about their competence, they feel more confident in their ability to do the thing, and then go figure, that decreased their anxiety about, oh, I don't want to do this incorrectly, because they now have successful repetitions, and instead of coming in saying, I hope I don't do this wrong, don't do this thing, they're trying to do the thing that they have already had success with. Now when it gets to who should be setting the goals, in the teacher-centric model, the teacher sets the goals. But Lynn Helding, again, I mentioned earlier, she's at the University of Southern California. I think she makes a very compelling case that cognitive science has been the missing 3rd pillar of voice pedagogy. The first pillar being anatomy and physiology, second pillar being voice acoustics, and then the 3rd pillar being cognitive science. How do people learn? And it's shifted. She believes that the shift is moving away from how people teach to how students learn. Kitty Verdolini, who teaches at our Summer Vocology Institute, talks about this wonderful revelation that she had when she was working with a client and had this just epiphany, and she said to the client, hold on, I'll come right back. And she went down to her supervisor's office and she said, I just realized what the whole goal of voice therapy is. And the supervisor was like, okay, what? She's like, the goal is for the client to get better. And he said, well, yeah. Well, what did you think the goal was? She's like, I thought the goal was for me to do a good job. The focus on her as the clinician and how she was working with the client, as opposed to the goal is that the student, the client, improves. So partly related to this, Lynn Helding says that when we're setting goals based on our understanding of cognitive science, that the goal setter has to be the student. The one setting the goal has to be the student. It can't be the teacher, it can't be a parent, it can't be a colleague, and that's because self-motivation, when it comes to actual learning, self-motivation is the most effective tool, the most effective form of motivation. So aspirations, as Lynn says, aspirations that are not one's own are doomed from the outset. So if someone says, this should be your goal, even if the student necessarily might actually agree with that, might say, yeah, that is something I want to accomplish. If it's not something that they have identified or that they have at least embraced, then they're not going to be as effective in accomplishing that goal. So a teacher-centric model would be contrary to our understanding of how cognitive science now could apply to studio teaching. And I think this is really wonderfully presented in this evidence-based voice pedagogy model that Kari Reagan has put forth, has written about a bit in her book, but also Kari, as well as Lynn Helding, Lynn Maxfield, and Ken Bozeman, all who have been mentioned in this talk previously, have helped flesh out some of these ideas in Journal of Singing articles that I would encourage you to look at. But Kari is saying, borrowed from the evidence-based medicine policy, that when we are engaging in evidence-based voice pedagogy, we are considering our own knowledge, our own experience, our own anecdotal evidence of what works in the studio. We are hopefully also informed enough about voice research that the voice research is informing our practices. But these two alone are not enough. If we are only using these, then we're probably using a teacher-centric approach. But if we are also including the student's goals and the student's perspectives and what the student is trying to get out of the experience, that is when we are really practicing evidence-based voice pedagogy. So I love that idea of the model. First of all, because it honors that as voice teachers, voice research and voice science is a crucial component. But there are also things that we do that we know work because we've used them and maybe even stumbled upon them, but we know that they work because we have experience. And we shouldn't not do those things that we know work just because they haven't been studied, or voice research hasn't necessarily confirmed that thing. Voice science hasn't given us an answer, as though that's what science does. But also importantly, that it has to also incorporate the student goals. They are the crucial component of a student-centric style of teaching. Billy also mentioned a study from 2007 where they actually looked specifically at rapport, the rapport between a student and teacher in this one-on-one studio instruction. And again, unsurprisingly, they found that these one-on-one lessons tends to encourage interpersonal relationships between teacher and student, tends to result in emotional connections between teacher and student. And go figure, when there is such an established rapport, there were increased student learning outcomes, right? I am of the generation I have heard many times, I am your teacher, I'm not your friend. I don't need to be your friend, I'm your teacher. I don't need to be your friend, I'm your parent. However, whatever case you want to use that. And to be sure, teacher and friend are different roles. But there is certainly some blurring in that we can be friendly, and when we have an emotional connection and where we have an established relationship with a student, that student's learning outcomes are probably going to improve. And I love how this has been incorporated into the science-informed voice pedagogy initiative that I have been involved with through the National Association of Teachers of Singing. I helped write the paper and I helped compile some of the resources. And they did their first Science-Informed Voice Pedagogy Institute this past summer. John Nix was one of the faculty for that, and he has this observation. You can find this all on the NATS website. I believe it's available for non-members, but they have a science-informed resources page. One of the resources that he says that he provides is a singer video observation, where you play a video of a singer, and then you have the students in the class identify the singer's strengths, identify the singer's issues, identify if the repertoire is a good fit, say, okay, if you were this person's teacher, what would you work on first? But then also importantly, he says, how would you establish rapport with this student? So he actually factors that into, if we're going to be successful, we have to be mindful of creating some rapport. And that requires a degree of knowledge of interpersonal interactions. What am I getting from this person? How can I speak to them that honors who they are, that I don't have to put on a character? I don't have to, as a middle-aged person, talk like a 20-something in order to create rapport, but I have to let that person know that I am completely invested and on board in their progress, in their success, and in their satisfaction as a human being who wants to sing. So it also gets to some issues that I explore that I, again, borrowed from others, but I explore in this article that, again, I think I shared, Compliance and Adherence, where there's studies from the medical field who found that patients who believed that their physicians were businesslike, who perceived them to be businesslike, were less satisfied with their experience with their doctors and were less likely to follow the directions that the doctors gave them. Whether that's following or taking medications, whether that's following through with therapy exercises or follow-up appointments, the patients were less likely to do what their doctors said, even if it was designed to improve their health. And conversely, and unsurprisingly, patients who felt that their doctors were warm and caring were more likely to follow through with the directions, prescriptions, procedures that the doctors gave them. So Kitty just very bluntly says, if you're a clinician, if your patients like you, they're more likely to follow your advice. And I think that works as a voice teacher as well. If your patients, if your students, if your clients like you, they're more likely to follow your advice. Now, what does like you mean? I don't think warm and caring is necessarily opposite of businesslike. I think you can have an agenda and you can be like, let's get to work. We have things to accomplish. Here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to help you get there. I think you can be somewhat businesslike without being anti-warm and caring, but we all probably have to find that balance on our own. This is a really great, the second of two articles that Elizabeth Ann Benson and Kate Rosen wrote for the Journal of Singing on anti-fat bias in the singing voice studio. And they have highlighted how the master-apprentice model is really falling out of favor in CCM categories. I think CCM, contemporary singers, are less bound by following rules. And there's also the very practical implication is that if you're an independent voice studio teacher, if people don't find you to be warm and caring, then they will go somewhere else. They will pay someone else to do their to take singing lessons from, right? And so because of that, it seems that universities, and especially classically centered university programs, seem to be the last places where some of this master-apprentice structure is still in place. And that's partly there because students often don't get to pick their teachers. Certainly at the undergraduate level, they're assigned a teacher, and if that teacher is a master-apprentice follower, then they just assume that that's how this is supposed to work, and they don't necessarily feel free to ask for or help create a more student-centered experience. They talk in the same article, Benson and Rosen, about studies that have found the collaborative learning to be incredibly effective, especially in one-on-one training models, as we see in student or in voice studio situations. They also acknowledge that this tends to impact folks from marginalized groups more so, that they benefit potentially even more from collaborative learning environments, because maybe they're used to being in environments where their needs are not necessarily recognized. And so they ask us to do some self-reflection on whether we feel that our self-perception as a teacher hinges on being known as a master, or if it could be more being known as a collaborator or a partner in finding your students' success. So something I've implemented in my own studio is the student veto. I do still suggest repertoire, but I no longer assign repertoire. I always ask for my students' input more and more. I just work on what they want to work on. If I make suggestions, my students know that they are free to reject that for any reason whatsoever. And I will say, oh, okay, well, here's what I like about what this song would help us address with your voice. So let's see if we can find a song together that serves that purpose, right? And it's in this article called Assigning Racially and Ethnically Specific Repertoire, but I think it works in many situations. I know of a voice teacher who would assign all of her Asian students songs from The King and I, and didn't give them the option to not do those songs. She said, you have to learn these songs because the industry is going to want you to know them and they're going to expect you to play these parts. Some of those students were like, I don't like that show. I don't think that reflects the Asian person's experience in positive ways, but never felt in that master-apprentice model that they could have that input because the teacher is the one who decides what they should be singing. So there are a couple of alternate models as I just start to wrap this up here. Alternate models that Billy mentions from different folks. The student-centered teaching model is certainly going to have a greater emphasis on the student's goals rather than the teacher's goals. That tends to motivate the students. It allows them to problem solve on their own, and they recognize that when they come to lessons, we're going to be working toward the same goal of solving your specific problems that you have identified you want to work on. There's also this compassionate music teaching model, which focuses on a lot of these characteristics that I think are just naturally part of the human experience that we could more intentionally bring into the studio. Certainly when a student feels that trust and empathy and inclusion and community and connection are valued and are part of the experience, they're going to be free to be vulnerable and to be expressive and to take risks in ways that could lead to positive performances. And then lastly, I think a lot of this gets to what Christopher Small addresses in musicking. And I'm paraphrasing here, these aren't direct quotes, but essentially, is the point of performing music so that we can honor the art form of music, or so that we can honor composers, many of whom have been dead for centuries? Is that why we do music, so that we can honor Mozart or Beethoven or whoever? Or is music there? Does it exist so that human beings can have something to experience together as performers, as colleagues, but also to give the audience an experience, right? This whole Sir John Eliot Gardner phenomenon, where he punched someone in his chorus because he was upset, and I don't know what's going on there, but certainly the Toscanini way of, well, he was so abusive to his orchestras, but oh, he could get them to sound so good. I don't care. If that's the way you get your orchestras to sound good, I don't want to be in your orchestra, and I would prefer not to pay money to go hear your orchestra. I prefer to have a collaborative experience where we are honoring each other, and I think that also honors the music. So that is the end of my prepared remarks. We have just a couple of minutes. I'm happy to entertain any questions, comments regarding any of the topics that we've covered today. As I also thank you very much for your time, patience, endurance. Ellie, sure, jump in.
Hi, thank you so much. I found it that the way that you communicate the information is very accessible, so it's been really, really useful to me. I was trained classically and have then moved into an area of teaching mostly CCM and musical theatre. And the tracheal pull thing is unbelievably useful to me because I've always had this very right and wrong view of breathing, which I've dragged from my past, which I've brought along with me. So the idea that actually it's not always sort of acoustic exploration to find these different timbres of voice, but actually it is quite involved with the kind of whole holistic mechanism, including the breathing, is really useful. So thank you for that. It was great information.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I hope no one walks away from any of this saying, oh, I've been doing this wrong all along, right? Maya Angelou said that when you know better, you do better. And so whether this is better or not, it's at least maybe we can entertain different ways of doing things. And of course we are going to do, anecdotally, we know things that work. And so that style of breathing works for certain things, but now maybe we can make adjustments that might also work or might work differently, maybe better for certain situations, for certain clients, for certain people. So I don't think this is a dismissal of all of those things that came before, but it's saying how can we continue to evolve, and when we have better techniques, better understandings, how can that translate to helping our students sing better?
Yeah, well, you do the best you can with what you know, don't you? So as long as you keep learning, then that's wonderful.
Which is why we're all here.
Thank you.
I do have a question regarding younger singers, because I find myself working with a lot of teenagers, high schoolers. I do have some adult students, and that kind of comes a lot easier to me. But as far as the developing voices, do you think these techniques, as far as like everything we talked about, do you think they still apply, or do you think we kind of have to think of it in a different way, especially when it comes to developing voices?
I would say generally probably the same things apply. You know, I'm trying to think specifically with like breathing. You know, children are going to experience respiration differently than adults, right? Because their bodies are different. They're not just mini adults. So if we come from a standpoint of acknowledging what they're doing well, what their natural inclination is for breathing, that may change as they continue to grow. It probably will change. But if we go with where they are now, rather than trying to get them to breathe in this super low abdominal way that might not be supported by their personal physiology, then that's a way that it can be adjusted. SOVTE, same kind of thing. I think it has some really nice beneficial impacts, but finding the right one that's going to work for that student, whether it's because of a gender difference or because of a genre difference or because of an age difference. You know, I think there are specific benefits that SOVTEs encourage, but to find out how to implement them with different populations, it might vary a little bit, and you know, you just have to kind of be mindful of that and see what you're getting. This is what I think it will lead to. If it doesn't, then okay, do we need to adjust and use a different kind of SOVTE, or is this not necessarily going to work for you? So I would say the principles will probably apply, but may need to be adjusted.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
Well, if there are no other comments, questions, once again, thank you so much. I forgot I even made a slide. I should show the slide. This one. Thank you right across my face. So thanks so much for your time, attention. Again, my email, I'll put it here in the chat. It's just brian.manternach@utah.edu. So if there are questions or clarifications, or if you want to continue the discussion at all, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to continue to engage. But otherwise, thank you all so much for being here. Great to see you all.
Thank you very much,
so much.
Brian. Thank
Take
you,
care.
everyone. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Brian, for presenting all that information in such an accessible way. There's not much else for me to say other than thank you once again on behalf of the Voice Study Centre for attending tonight. I will send the recording out tomorrow, which is Friday, and I wish you all well on the rest of your day, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you.